So hello and welcome to another Stone Ridge Confab. Looking forward to today's conversation. It's been a little bit since we've gone through basically the entire platform to discuss a little bit more in detail in terms of what the Microsoft platform is. And all the different types of technologies that we have really grown accustomed to, basically to address any type of the business challenges that you have out there. So really looking forward today to actually going through that in a little bit more detail, kind of demystifying it a little bit, kind of identifying, just quite candidly, like there's so much and you hear so much from consulting companies when it comes to the Microsoft platform. It's just kind of nice to know, like, why is there so much gray? Like, why isn't it as easy as, like, if I go with a competitor product, they have exactly everything figured out? And quite candidly, they've got it figured out for their own way, right? And that, I think, is a really important distinction, because you'd be amazed at the ways that people use tools to accomplish tasks in the world. And software is really no different. And how we use that software obviously then drives, some of that further capability and discussion around that. So looking forward today to covering that in more detail. If you've never been on a Stone Ridge Confab before, I'll just give a quick intro. So Confab is basically about an interactive experience where you can ask questions about business systems, right? You can basically dive in and chat, you can interact, and you can vocalize what you like and what you don't like. The point here is to have the reality of the Microsoft platform and the capabilities of it that we resell. And so we're pretty close to the capabilities. We understand them. We started as a company that focused on Dynamics, but now we pretty much do everything on the Microsoft stack. So we're excited to be able to just give that knowledge to you to really dive in more detail, obviously. My name is Scott Frappier. I'm typically the host on this, basically. My title at Stone Ridge is what's called the Chief AI Architect. Fancy title for Jack of all trades, master of some. I get to know kind of the different technologies that we put into businesses to basically then enable them for the future and help leaders really understand what direction they need to go so that our team can really help them accomplish that goal or task. I've been in the industry now for about 25 years. Right out of college, I got into the business system space. Some people would call me a glutton for punishment, I guess, but that is absolutely kind of my career, and that's what I built off of this. So really looking forward to going through that today as well. And here we go. Rob already has a post in here. Once you think you have it figured out, you're not looking in the right direction, right? You nailed it. Like, it is very common that we have these conversations with team members and also with obviously prospects and customers that we interact with. There's just so much to this, right? And I think, that's good and bad. And I will say, I kind of miss sometimes the old days of the classic side of it, where you just had Office, for example, and Exchange and SharePoint. And then obviously with the introduction of Azure and this cloud concept, holy cow, did we go from basically a couple of products to a bunch of different products that are out there. And now we've even gone further than that. So, like, let's back up for a second. You can agree to disagree with me, and I'd be curious on what your thoughts are as well around this. But let's think about it this way. So back in the day with software, it was nerds like me that basically did software development, right? I remember learning Borland, C++, Turbo Pascal, all these languages in high school because it was an attraction to me. Quite candidly, it was an attraction to me because I wanted to make video games, right? And I bet you a lot of you probably did that. But what I learned is that code is hard. Code is abstract. Code has so many concepts to it that make it like a language, like a French or like German or whatever it may be. And I'd even argue sometimes it's even more complex because assembly and some of these other languages that it's based off of are very number centric. So there's a very small amount of people that could actually create inside of computer systems. And we've seen a progression over time not only in the Microsoft stack, but in the industry in general, where we've gone from, for example, these low-level machine code to assembly to just abstracting a little bit more with C and then moving to Objective-C and C++, right? And then bringing in the languages like Visual Basic or some of the languages that exposed more of the business users to be able to create applications to be able to run your business. And as we see these generations of technology change, it's been really exciting to see what the products are that help with that. But it's also created a dichotomy inside of platforms. And what do I mean by that? Well, the citizen developer versus the pro dev, right? If you're a pro dev, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, and it's kind of interesting because I get to have conversations with people about this all the time. And I will tell you that it is not black and white, and there are benefits to both. I remember even last week, I was on a call where somebody that was more pro dev said that the biggest mistake that the industry ever made was to coin citizen developers. And then, I had to bite my tongue. I really did. I was patient with it. And why was I? Because I think that there's always a perspective where there's truth and objectivity inside of somebody's statement that I want to entertain and I want to learn off of, right? So what was fun about that, though, was the fact that it really does then highlight, obviously, some of those perspectives that we look at and what we need to do as an industry to really do better, right, inside of our software and set the right expectation with leaders. And I think that that's the key thing, the expectation setting, right? Too often, you'll hear in a sales process that it's easy, and then you find out it's hard. Well, let's demystify that today. Let's talk a little bit more of that dichotomy and then also what you can do to really use the technologies to drive things forward. And as you have questions or comments, please feel free to post them in chat. Love to hear more feedback, and we've got a lot of people kind of going into detail here, right? Or once you think of it, have it all figured out, it changes, right? Cindy, you nailed it. Carly, I'm glad you're excited for the conversation today. And MyCore Gaming, hey, woo, to go Stone Ridge, love Confab. I appreciate that. We take pride in what we do here. So let's go ahead and dig in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I've got a PowerPoint slide just to start framing this up. And we'll really start with the more modern slide because it's more fun to kind of look at. So inside of the industry, there's been this evolution that we've had from our tool set. And like I said before, I think the big thing here for our tool set has been the fact that we do more now, obviously, than we did in the past with different types of tools depending upon the need for the business. So what do I mean by that? Well, when we look at the Microsoft platform, this is the slide that you'll typically see a partner kind of lead with. And then, of course, there'll be the FUD slide with the competition on why we're so much better, right? I show it because obviously it matters here. And Deb, I appreciate the call, but I'm going to have to put myself to do not disturb so I'm not getting calls on Teams as we're doing this. So, but, net result here is that there's a lot of different products that the Microsoft stack has. And even with the recent announcements that Microsoft made, there's been a change even around how we organize around that in terms of the divisions at Microsoft. I know a lot of people are either on the AI hype train or the naysay train, Once again, welcome to life. There's a lot of gray in between that. But what happened as well is that Microsoft has recognized the fact that a lot of these types of tool sets that we're going to talk about today actually do coexist better. And it's not just because of the Microsoft stack as we would classically say in the past. It's because of the people experience. And that's what I want to center on here to start the conversation. Because remember, the goal of technology isn't to make it so that technology is in its own vacuum and solves its own problems because it's technology. That's the entire opposite of why we create technology. We create technology to make our lives easier. That is the most fundamental way to describe technology. And I'm sure there's going to be nuance to that. But if you think about it, the way that we have, for example, heart monitors on watches, we're basically making it so that we can track our fitness capabilities where we could have done that before by stopping and taking our pulse, but having something always connected makes that easier. How many of you remember the good old watches that you would put, and then you'd have the strap that you would put when you were doing triathlons? I totally remember those all the time. But once again, technology evolves and it allows for more people then to use that technology because it's simplified potentially as well. The best technology is the technology you can use intuitively. And that's something that Steve Jobs really fundamentally kind of programmed into me throughout my tenure of, for example, the phone. Who wants a stylus? The finger is the most powerful tool that a human being has to interact with the device. So when we think about technology and we think about what Microsoft is doing, Microsoft has a broad variety of people that we need to really interact with right as we go through this. We have individuals that are super pro dev that want to dive deep into large language model transformer architectures and do the back propagation and the programming and the statistical alignment to create their own custom models, maybe for a very specific purpose. Just even recently, I saw on the Local Llama Reddit page that somebody had created an actual large language model where they took 6 gigabytes of text messages that were sent in London back in the day and made an AI large language model so that when they put a prompt in, it would respond them back with like a large language model works with content that was from 1845. And I found that very interesting because that is such a low level type of task that could have profound effects in how we actually interact with technology. Examples of that apply to real world scenarios, having it so that cameras can detect people, places, things, or whatever it is by basically installing a small large language model on the camera. They call that edge computing, as you've heard probably in the past, but it's using the same technologies and concepts that we use, for example, in AI with large language models, but they're installing it on a little camera. And that's pretty cool because that makes it so that the technology can be used to identify images and capabilities that it's been trained off of. So once again, there's lots of different things and different people that use then those technologies. So let's start kind of at the highest level here, which is really about there's the end users that use, right? And so that's going to be really where all of our creation comes into play. So just as an example with that, there's going to be a lot of people that don't want to write code, that don't want to use a visual designer to create things, right? Totally fine. What do we do in those situations? Well, we have applications that they can access. What's one of those applications that we can access? It's Excel, right? Or it's Word that we learn about. So as I pop open Excel as an example and just kind of open it up and bring it front and center here, we have Excel that allows me to interact from a user experience perspective to accomplish a goal, which is a spreadsheet. So remember, spreadsheets were made long ago. They were one of the very first applications after a word processor that came out that businesses started to consume and use. It allowed us to create lists of information that we could keep track of and to create columns that then allow us to classify those lists of data, right? So the really cool thing about this from a Microsoft platform is that there's a plethora of different applications that address this. So what we're starting at the highest level is the usage then of these different types of applications. From Excel, for example, to even, for example, different types of applications. So just as an example inside of here, if I go ahead and open up Dynamics, this is another example then of an application that an end user would typically interact with. And mind you, we're getting more and more complex as we go deeper and deeper here, but the net result is that when we start with the end user, we're able to basically identify then a plethora of different applications then that are used for productivity. And I think that that's the key thing to note here, is that Microsoft was really built on productivity apps to start, right? And let's back up and think about that. What do you mean by that, Scott? Well, Windows was the operating system. It allowed people to run applications, fundamentally, right? DOS, whatever it may be, that's what we interacted with. I remember the first version of MS-DOS that I installed, 6.2, and then it was upgraded to 6.22, and it was all command-based, and I'd have to type in commands and all those other types of things. I'll tell you what, that wasn't very intuitive, but it allowed me to play different games. It allowed me to load applications, and it allowed me to interact with the computer system. And the operating system was the very first end user type experience that we interacted with inside of the industry. After we had that, you know what happened after that? We started to get into biz apps, right? Because IBM saw such a potential basically in the business application space to help with productivity. So we got Word, we got different types of word processors, we got Excel spreadsheet based capabilities, and that evolved as well over time. And eventually, what happened is we had two segments typically that were then designed by Microsoft. Because what they saw, for example, is that not only did we have DOS, for example, to run these applications, but we needed a market of people to create them. So what happened? We had then obviously the development environments that were created. So we were able to program in different types of BASIC, for example, with DOS, and maybe you used Turbo Basic back in the day with Borland, right? But we were able to go through and start using those capabilities as developers. But really, what it created was this segmentation of developers that were highly technical in nature. And so what do I mean by that? Well, if you wanted to create a device driver, if you wanted to create an application for Windows 3.11, you know how complex that was if you have developed in the past. I remember the first application that I had to create using, I think it was Borland C++ that I got introduced into it, to write a window, so like an MDI, multiple document interface window. I had to write I remember it was like 5 pages of code to create that, just to create the box, just to create I don't even think it had minimize and maximize on it. I think it just had some of those basic base concepts that are inside of it. So once again, this limited the concept of creativity then in the market. And good and bad, right? Because once again, we're getting introduced more and more into these different types of technologies. But the net result is that it really focused on the pro dev perspective with it. So over time, we have seen this more often be a part of the industry until really probably around even the 2010, and I dare say maybe a little bit sooner than that, where all of a sudden we started to see technologies that were being introduced that basically made it so that development teams didn't have to worry about the plumbing underneath the application. So what do I mean by that? So there's different technologies. One of them that was prominent back in the day was this technology called Silverlight, right? And I know a lot of people are going to poo-poo this, and they're going to say that was a horrible technology. And yeah, right? So it's kind of like the Flash days, right? Which is really probably the impetus more for this than anything, was that we started to see this evolution of graphic designers being able to create rich content inside of these different types of experiences that started to prove that we could create what are called line of business applications back in the day. And if you've heard that term before, it's a pretty fun concept, because really what it was is it was about basically making it so that you could quickly create applications that addressed a specific need. Silverlight to me on the Microsoft platform was absolutely that fundamental stepping stone for that. And I know there's a lot of people that will argue off of it, but if you think of the technologies that came off of Silverlight, so XAML, for example, that we use in our modern architectures to basically define a visual representation by using markup language instead of actually writing code to create it, that was a fundamental shift. It's basically creating a template language that you use versus using code to then control window orientation, size, and all those details that were related to it. I remember working with Magenic at the time, and we built a Silverlight application for a customer that basically needed to be able to keep track of different types of transactions that they were doing at different types of facilities throughout the United States. And they needed to be able to log in and easily create, for example, those types of records. We would have done that in HTML with CSS and all those other types of technologies at the time. It would have taken tens of thousands of hours, and we were able to do it in around 700 to 800 hours because Silverlight provided us that back-end plumbing to make a solution that a business could use without a large amount of investment around it. Henceforth, the introduction of the citizen type developer concept that started to proliferate across the market. So once again, if you think about where we're going in the future here and what we think of the Microsoft stack, you're going to see those two different types of technologies and two types of user bases that are going to continue to break out with that, right? And it's a really important concept. So I'm going to answer some of the chat here, and I'm curious on what people think. Please pop it in the chat here if you've got questions or comments. So Rob, yep, Walkman was cool to take music on the run. You right? I remember being a kid and having the good old cassette tapes, and now I get told by my kids, turn on the internet. Like, really? That's what I'm told by my kids. Papa, can you turn on the internet? Okay. Kids, when I was your age, I was reading books in the back and listening to cassette tapes, and I had the CD player that would skip, and then I got the 10-second ESP, and then that was amazing, so on and so forth. Right, I'm starting to date myself now, so you nailed it, Rob. Mr. Twos, yes, Silverlight was a great stepping stone for the rich content in the browser. You nailed it. I think one of the big evolutions that we've seen has been this cloud architecture, right, that we've kind of seen as part of it. Now, one of the things just to kind of note here, I'm going to go to another slide that we typically show, and these are older slides that we go through. But it really starts to talk just about all the different types of technologies that we typically interact with from a cloud platform perspective. And once again, this is really important because it really defines then why we use different tooling to accomplish those goals. So for example, if you think about what Microsoft typically does as their design pattern, and this is really important and it applies directly to Copilot enablement that we've seen in terms of the application set. So what Microsoft will usually do is they'll start at the very base level. Data and Azure are those typical base levels. And so what do I mean by that? Well, when we built Copilot as an example from a Microsoft lens, it wasn't something that all of a sudden was enabled for citizen-style developers to go through and then create different content around. Instead, it was fundamentally tackled at the lowest level to start. Because to build a scalable service that goes through millions of people, maybe even billions, we're not talking, a business that has 10,000 users, we're talking millions to billions of interactions that an application has to tackle. Well, in that situation, ProDev is absolutely the right way to go. Think about it. It's the abstraction level that allows for the utmost control in terms of how code interacts with hardware. There's nothing faster, there's nothing more efficient than being able to write at that lowest level. Now, it makes a very, 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 very small subset of resources, because remember, this always goes back to people, but it makes a very small subset of resources that can then instill that type of capability. How many people do you know in your business that can read assembly language? But assembly is used in even graphic engines for games, that's used on the Microsoft platform, for example, to speed up different types of access. For example, SQL Server has optimization that is assembly level language specific to make index searches and crawls, for example, more efficient inside of the application. This is documented, this is known. And it doesn't matter that the language becomes C# or if it becomes the next language that's out there, there's going to be that need to have that level of optimization inside of code. So in Microsoft, if we take Copilot as the example for it, when the large language model industry exploded with OpenAI's introduction of GPT-4, what happened is Microsoft focused at that lowest level. They took the technology and then they started to use the entire Azure system and ecosystem that they had to start creating the tooling that was going to be needed to be able to support us as developers, the next level beyond Microsoft, to create. And as you probably know, if you've been a developer in the channel and went through this, the first year of Copilot, it was mayhem. It was absolute mayhem. We didn't know what Copilot could do. We didn't know what, dare say, the whole industry didn't know what large language models did. We didn't understand what are the best use cases for it. We had people hyping it, saying it was the best thing since sliced bread and trying to apply it towards scenarios that wouldn't work. We had then that coming out into the community, and all of a sudden there's the naysayers that crawl out. In fact, the AI bubble is going to pop. Well, once again, that is the problem with learning in an industry when it's front and center. And candidly, I would dare argue that that happens in any type of disruptive technology where we're going to have basically those polar ends. And then once again, really, the good stuff is in the middle as we go through that. It's not the difference. It's not the best at the beginning and it's not the best at the end. It's the middle that matters as we go through this journey. So once again, as we kind of go through that, Microsoft starts building up that tooling. And then so what do we get? We get these different platforms that serve basically those different needs. And some of these needs then are blended as we go through this. And I think that's a really important aspect just to kind of note. If you are a developer, the single best thing that you can do as a developer is to enable citizen developers to be able to create applications. Hands down, period. Why do I say that? Microsoft did that for you. Microsoft designed the lowest end capability of the platform with their engineering and architecture teams to allow you to create different types of applications for your business. Period. They have included you in that journey. They may not do the best at it all the time, but they've included you. Why did they do that? Because they know that the more that we have a community, the better we're going to be able to push those technologies and sell ultimately those technologies to people that need them, right? Whether or not you agree with the technology or not, or the business model, that's different. Because every business is going to go down the path of trying to tell you why their product is better than the other products with it. But when you have the dichotomy that is created inside of the industry, where, for example, a developer looks at a citizen developer as not somebody I can truly create, well, what do you think the engineering team thinks of you at Microsoft? So what I'd like to do here is back up and start making this even more pronounced in terms of what we do to help people enable their business. And this is a cultural aspect at Stoneridge that I'm super proud of, where everyone is looking to use these technologies to address the business need. And that's what's different at Stoneridge. When we started the organization, we focused on business process enablement, and the business process need drives the technology that's needed to get to that goal, which means sometimes Microsoft technologies are not the right answer. Other times, they are the best answer. And then other times, there's pros and cons that are listed obviously off of both of them. So let's kind of dive into this a little bit deeper now that you know those dichotomies to really understand where we're going for a platform. So the first thing that we typically like to talk through is that when we create, we like to talk about Azure, right? And Azure really is that pro dev perspective that we typically interact with in order to basically create. So in this example, I'm going to go ahead and log into Azure, and we're going to look at the different types of technologies and why we use these technologies for businesses inside of our environment. So as I log in here and click on No, we'll go into our pre-sales environment so I don't break anything. And let's go through and just start talking about like what are these technologies that we typically interact with to go faster. Now this portion of the conversation is absolutely more geared towards ProDev because usually ProDev is going to be interacting then with these technologies to create applications. And the thing to note here is that a lot of application development now doesn't occur with local applications that are typically installed on servers inside of your environment. Can you typically do that? Yeah, you can. You absolutely can. For example, you can actually go ahead and use Visual Studio. You can create a C# application that when you click on your Start menu, for example, and you want to open something up, it'll open up that application and run natively on your computer. Totally acceptable. There are many use cases that make that really relevant. Examples of that might be even to create services that connect basically applications that have not been turned into cloud-based applications, but data access that's needed, such as making a WCF service Windows Communication Foundation so that you can actually call then that service through OData or SOAP or basically through a web service to then have it coordinate the data on-prem to get that back to your application. Now, Microsoft has a bunch of applications that already do that as well, but the net result is that we're never going to get away from developing applications on computers that are just native to the computer stack. But that will be typically more of a pro dev scenario. There's nuance to this though. Examples to nuance might be field service applications that then store data locally on a device. So that way, when you're in remote connectivity scenarios, you can actually continue to do transactions. But once again, usually now from a business perspective, that's not a technology that you're going to assign your IT team to kind of tackle as part of that. It's going to be built into the application that's been built already either by Microsoft or by a competitor, or in the rarest situation, maybe you design that by using SQL Server Express that you install on a Windows device that then does those types of transactions. So once again, that's a whole different level of pro dev still. The more common pro dev scenarios is that we start interacting with Azure. In Azure, if you look at it, if I want to create a resource, holy cow, right? Like, Scott, what are all these different resources? I can do compute resources, I can do DevOps, I can do identity management resources, I can make mixed reality, I can do security, I can do storage. This has been kind of the bane, to be quite honest, of the Azure platform. We joked about it when it came out. We joked about it when it got bigger. We joke about it now. Wait a week, you'll have a new application or new technology that'll be exposed on Azure that then will be this next new greatest thing. Well, some of those great things did turn into great things. So let's talk about what those great things are that we typically do interact with in the business system space to really drive, for example, different types of services that we interact with then in Azure to create applications. Now, one of those, just quite candidly, is virtual machines, right? If we start at the most base level inside of the Azure framework, being able to create a Windows computer instead of using VMware ESXi or VMware Workstation as we used to in the past, a virtual machine is a very powerful concept that allows you to take basically your data from on-prem and bring it then into a virtual machine that can then do that processing. So that way, for example, you can scale up the machine without buying a huge server that then you invest the money around for it. Now, the problem with virtual machines, if we go ahead and click on Create just as an example, is the fact that if we look at, for example, the different types of instances that we can actually create that are related to this, this is where a lot of people are like, well, wait a second, Scott, like this is way more expensive than just buying a server and then doing the hardware for it. And you're right, it is. Initially, if you have an application that needs to run 24/7, you need to think about, for example, scaling. You have to think about what is the type of machine requirement that I have because now I'm renting this as opposed to buying the server for it. But what you also have to think through are other scenarios, such as what happens if I have to scale up during a period of time, meaning I need more resources for that virtual machine. What happens if the server fails? What happens if I have a natural disaster that's related to it? What happens if I lose connectivity to my main hub for internet and I need to now have basically two different computers that are in two different regions with two different internet connections to be able to manage that? What happens now that I've gone through and opened up my firewall for a port that's made my attack surface more prone to ransomware or to some of those other types of probing that can occur because now you've exposed RDP or some other technology to allow people to gain access then into your internal network. Now, I don't use these as fear. I just use these as the reality as to where basically we see our customers go and why they then use these technologies and why the cost offset then when done properly, it creates a huge amount of value for you. So examples of that, instead of buying the machine and then putting VMware or Hyper-V on it and then running all that and maintaining that with resources, shut down the machine at the end of the day of work, right? Doesn't need to run potentially for a lot of given scenarios. Size down or scale down the machine, go from a D12 to a D2. Instead of $1.45 an hour, it goes to 20 cents an hour, right? So these are the concepts that are new and foreign to people where having physical hardware next to them was always a powerful influence. John Comrack of id Software, as you know, or went to Meta now, he stated that one of the biggest things that was a loss for him was the fact that he didn't jump on the Azure or the cloud computing wagon because he loved to have that GPU running right next to him. He said that that was a mistake, and he said that even recently. And so once again, remember that this type of a tool, if used properly, can help your business save money. Now, devs are typically going to do this in IT from an infrastructure perspective, but if we look at some of the other resources then, I'm just going to go ahead and close out of that. Let's talk through some of the other popular different types of technologies that are typically used inside of here. So storage accounts are another one that are really relevant for businesses. And why do I say that? Because this is basically where we can then do DFS, or we can have file shares, and we can store large amounts of data for super cheap. And what do I mean by super cheap? Pennies per gigabyte? Like, if you think about it, if your business has a large amount of data, a storage account is where we can hold that data. And storage accounts also enable for us from a development perspective to use different types of concepts like data lakes. Data lakes allow for us to create really a structured way of viewing our data from all these different types of business systems so that we can then ingest or use that in other user-based tools, such as Power BI, to basically go through and do reporting inside of an organization. But storage accounts are really where that starts. When we start talking about Fabric, when we start talking about analytics, for example, a storage account backing is very typically used inside of that technology set. Now, we've got more than that as well, right, from the pro dev side that we'll dig into even further here. Examples of that would be using things like storage accounts or even using SQL Server, right? So if I search for SQL Server, we're going to see that we have SQL Server and Windows that we can run as a virtual machine, but we also have Azure SQL that we can run, right? So once again, SQL Server has been transitioned into not only running, for example, in a virtual machine where you can then have your applications, but you can also then have an Azure SQL, so that way you don't have to worry then about the hardware perspective from a virtual machine side of it. So imagine it as a platform as a service versus a virtual machine is more of infrastructure as a service. So this is the IaaS versus PaaS concept that's out there. And then we use those at different levels. So when you need total control over a SQL server, where you need to be able to take the server, put it on different types of disks because you need to scale more for high performance situations, well, you're going to have way more granularity and control using a virtual machine because you can create storage accounts that then have different type of IOP requirements that are there that can really scale that out. So a high-end website, for example, may make sense to have with, almost 1 million users interacting with it. A virtual machine might make more sense to do that with SQL Server because of that granular control that you have. But in a lot of applications, you don't need that. Instead, you may just want to use Azure SQL then to be able to do that. Just as an example, a lot of the different Dynamics products on the back end actually use the Azure SQL technology that's abstracted then from you as you go through those different types of transactions inside of the environment. So once again, when we look at Azure, this is where we start getting into really that pro dev perspective with it. Now, one of the final ones I want to kind of show is just a couple here, because obviously we could talk about this for hours and hours to go through all the different types of technologies. But there's probably 3 more prominent ones that really stand out to me that are commonly used then on the Azure platform to basically create applications for your end users. One of them is absolutely going to be now Azure OpenAI, right? So Azure OpenAI, absolutely the lowest level typically that you can get to on the Microsoft platform to basically go through and then create large language models as a service offering on the Microsoft platform. So what do I mean by that? So let's take a look at this. This is really eye-opening because this is what Microsoft created for developers to basically go through and on Azure AI Foundry as an example, to basically go through and then allow you to go and create different types of instances that you can interact with, obviously, inside of here. So can you right now take a model like at Hugging Face? Can you download a model and can you then use local llama, whatever it is to actually run that model then in a virtual machine? You can absolutely do that. Like I would say that's probably the most closest pro dev perspective that you can get right now with large language models. And it's a very valid approach. Once again, granularity. You have to kind of offset what that means in your environment. But when we think about from a Microsoft perspective, if I want to be able to interact, for example, with different types of models, well, how would I do that? Meaning, I don't want to worry about the virtual machine and all that kind of stuff. I want to be charged by token to basically interact then from a developer perspective with this technology. Well, Azure AI Foundry is going to allow me to get to that level of granularity where, for example, here what I can do is I can go into my Azure AI Foundry portal, and in Azure AI Foundry, what I can do is I can basically go through and then set up different types of models that I can interact with. I can create very high level or low level envelopes, or excuse me, agents that are inside of here as well, that are then interacted with from a more pro dev perspective of actually, for example, having a heartbeat connection to an agent and then interacting with it with code and creating custom methods so that I can call it as a service to interact with it, to interact basically with that. But what I can also do then, and this is a really cool concept that is super powerful then when it comes to like Azure and for example the pro dev perspective with models, is that I can deploy models that are not just Microsoft models. And this is just eye-opening for you if you're pro dev. I want to have GPT-5. Well, you know, we've got that with the option in the citizen dev experience, but I can, for example, create a GPT-5 chat model and then basically have that model accessible via a web endpoint that I can create applications against. I could create a GPT-4.1 model, some of the foundation models. I could actually go through and even then create, if you look even further down here, different models. I can use the Chinese DeepSeek model if I wanted to. I can use the Grok model if I want to, with Elon Musk obviously for that. I can use our Llama models from Meta. I can go ahead and use as well our different types of Gemini models potentially. So if we look for it just to see, we'll see if the Gemini is inside of here for it. We got Mistral, we got Phi as part of it. So once again, these models though allow for us to then interact basically with these different types of large language models. Because in the future here, the thing I want to just kind of pronounce is that one model isn't going to be the best model to rule them all. It's not the Lord of the Rings where one ring will rule them all. Each model requires a large amount of compute resources to train it to make it so that it is the best autocomplete based capability that it can have. Because remember, these large language models are just a sophisticated autocomplete. They're amazing at what they can autocomplete, but at the most fundamental level, they are about finding the statistically correct next word from your prompt that you create based upon what is the context of that particular prompt. So once again, this is a huge technology set that's used then that drives a lot of that. And we go beyond that as well then. So obviously that's one big technology. The other one that I want to kind of note here that we use from a pro dev perspective very often inside of the business system space is also going to be logic apps. So what is logic apps? Logic apps allows me to create different types of steps that are like a flow inside of Power Automate to basically do a visual representation of what I want a process to accomplish. A workflow engine is an oversimplification of it, but at a very high level, that's what a lot of people equate to it. Being able to create a logic app allows me basically to ensure that I can have messaging, that I can have security around it, that I can, for example, then have different types of endpoints and connections that I can interact with. And as an example here, we'll do a Confab example logic app inside of here. Allows me to go through and then make different types of applications that I can then have events occur. So an example of that might be in Dynamics 365, if I have a new record that's added, instead of using a Power Automate flow, I use a logic app to do that because I want to have IT manage that particular flow inside of our business or that workflow inside of the business. So Logic Apps allows me basically to go through and do that from more of a pro dev and IT management perspective, which obviously is a really important concept for a lot of organizations. Sometimes citizen development has gotten a bad rap because what does it do? It allows everyone to create everything. And that free-for-all is more of the common pushback that we see then inside of that particular industry, right? In terms of that capability, excuse me. So it's something to note here is that it's really important to know that Logic Apps, for example, is like Power Automate for Pro Dev, but allows you then to create those different types of flows that are related to it. And as you can see here, our Logic app was actually created in the background here, and now we should be able to go through, for example, and then interact obviously with that Logic app by going into Logic Apps again, and then from there, as part of the deployment inside of here, once it refreshes and creates that, we would then be able to obviously interact and then create that type of Logic app process, very similar then to a what you see is what you get environment for the steps it needs to go through. It can call different applications. If we go to the resource just really quickly here, we see that we have this particular one. I can create that workflow in the designer, and I can basically create a new one inside of here, and we can do agents, stateful, stateless as a part of it, right? So in this example, quickest I could do, right? And I could basically go through these different steps to basically make sure then that I can go through and then create, for example, that particular workflow. And so once again, this is just a really important concept, just to name here, that it allows you to go through and quickly use these graphical designers to go through and basically make these flows, so to speak, inside of the environment. Now, I'm going to just go really quickly here for one last one because we're getting time here. The other one I want to kind of mention as well. So there are more. Service bus is an example of another one that we use, basically making it so that integrations, when we have communication from one application to another, that we can basically componentize that communication and guarantee that it is serially delivered before we then process it. We think about it, it's called Azure Service Bus. We used to call it Message Bus inside of Windows. I remember developing applications that would then use that technology. The other ones that are inside of here, just really quickly, Entra for security, which is the Azure Active Directory, obviously. And then the only last one I just want to kind of mention from a pro dev perspective is the fact that function apps, right? Azure functions are also another very important concept. So these are, for example, code that we can create that get hosted then as an app service, as a consumption-based service, as a container, that allow us then to interact, obviously, with these types of functions, such as I want to call you to take and run code that then processes this and provides an output with it. So that's obviously what a function app is. It's basically like a logic app, but I'm using code to do it. So it allows me to kind of balance that middle, so to speak, where now I need more pro dev capability because maybe I need to calculate all the different random versions of pi to a certain character limit, and I want to use a specific type of algorithm to do that. Have fun doing that in a logic app. You could probably do it. Probably want to do that with a function app. Or maybe a business case would be I've got containerization that I want to compute based upon length, width, and height. Give me my best plan for the different product sizes I have, and I don't want to wait 10 minutes for the compute. I want it to come back in 2 seconds. I do a function app to do that, right? So that's where those types of technologies really start landing them. So now, once we go beyond that, we're like, okay, great, Scott. That covers a lot of those different types of base capabilities inside of here. This is where we start getting into the cross. And this is where I see more of the conflict. But once again, this conflict isn't necessarily needed. It's more about the organization and making sure that they have the proper controls in place to do that. And what do I talk about with that? Well, you guessed it, the Power Platform. So Power Platform to me is absolutely the evolution basically of what we saw inside of the environment when we actually went through and changed from Silverlight into our new environments. And right here is the example of that. So the Power Platform allows for citizen developers, right, to create applications that allow you then to do really basic things. So just as an example around that, if I want to create an application, this is where we're at. And this is really important as a concept to understand of how developers and how the pro dev side of this needs to make sure they understand how we actually enable people on the Power Platform to create. Because I will tell you, I have seen some absolute amazing things that people have been able to create basically inside of these environments. From teachers creating basic applications to keep track of lists to having pro dev actually use the tooling to go through and then create front ends very rapidly that they then integrate from a more pro dev perspective on the back end as well. So this concept is a blend. And what I would always challenge people to do is to basically use your pro dev to enable your citizen dev, because you're going to have better output and results with that. So just as an example, if I want to create an application, it is as simple basically as I need an application to keep track of food stock that I have at my house, right? We'll get started with Copilot. I never thought we'd be here. Like, honestly, I'm not writing a single line of code. I'm just putting something in on Confab. Food item, food category. Fantastic, right? Okay. The name, category, quantity, expiration date, is it frozen or not? Then I've got category names that it made it. It actually made 2 tables that were related to it. Okay. Save and open an app. Go ahead and open it. Just made an application. Right? So, is it perfect? Absolutely not. Right? Like, there's so much more to unload with this. I get it entirely. But as a template to start and to have these tools to create, this is where and why the Power Platform is so powerful. I can create applications very rapidly by using prompts inside of AI now to basically go ahead and build this out. I can see from a table design a what you see is what you get based environment where I can click on it and add additional columns and fields and interact with it. And I'm not saying that you don't have to be technically minded for it. We're not saying that just a normal business user is going to be able to do that immediately. But as you can see, being able to create that bar of entry for creating an application here that in the past, this would have taken me 5 pages of code to create. And on Confab, in literally 2 minutes, I've gone through and created, for example, a new welcome screen. I've basically made it so that I can scale it to different types of devices. So if I have an iPhone 8, I'd be interacting with it from that perspective. I could create a new food category or use a food category and edit it inside of here. Or I can click on the home and I can go to my food item as an example, and I can create new food items that I'm going to keep track of inside of here. I can say I've got 2 chickens, right, that are frozen inside of here, and I'm going to put that in the food category of meat and then save that away. Like, let's just back up and just marvel at this for just 1 second. Because yes, have we had templates that we could use in Visual Studio Code? We absolutely did. But making it so that we can basically go to different types of devices and then interact with that, and what you see is what you get designer. and go through here and add additional fields and add, for example, new screens very rapidly and quickly. This is Silverlight on steroids. I didn't have to worry about the communication framework with it. I didn't have to worry about the theming related to it. I didn't have to worry about how the fetch interval is going to be and how many records it grabs. Instead, I get to worry about the screen and what I'm interacting with, right? So this is the concept when we start thinking about then how we as teams use these tools to really drive these types of applications. And how far does this go? Well, this is how far this goes. If we go in, for example, into our finance and operations environment that is linked basically to Dynamics 365, and we take a look at what was created by Microsoft using the Power Platform to basically go through and drive different types of business processes. If I click on my apps inside of here, and I go to my all, for example, and I look at my Sales Hub right here, the Sales Hub, this is Dynamics 365 for sales. I don't know if you knew that, but this is a model-driven app that was built on the Power Platform that has a combination of citizen dev concepts that are put into it. An example of this would be in our environment, I would go through, sorry Carrie and team, but I would go through and add new fields, new forms to keep track of information that we would then use on opportunities and leads and in the sales life cycle. Did I write code? No, I didn't write any code. I logged in and basically went through to that particular table, right-click, added a new field, told it was a text value or a number value or whatever the value was, and basically then I was able to interact with it. And so in this environment, as an example, this is a model-driven app that allows me basically to use Dynamics 365 for sales to do, for example, my account management or my lead management or any of these other areas inside of the application that I can then use and customize these by basically going into then that model-driven app, going to the table, and then updating or creating a new view that's related to it. So this is the bridge then that allows companies to go faster. It allows for you to add new fields to gather and keep track of that data and then interact with it. And what's really cool about the Power Platform is it doesn't stop at just like making apps. It also interacts with the automation potential inside of the business. So just as an example around that, if we go to Power Automate, right? Power Automate is the user version level or citizen dev level version of what we interact with Logic Apps. This allows you to create automates or flows that do particular actions then in that environment. So if I go to my flows as an example inside of here, and I want to create a new flow, just as a quick example, I can create one from a template. So when an email attachment comes into OneDrive, or when an email comes in with an attachment, I want to save it to OneDrive automatically, right? That would be one example of it. Or if I want to create a flow where I do an instant cloud flow, what I can do is I can basically have it where any type of a trigger, and I mean any type of trigger, like look at this, like I can, for example, when Dynamics has some type of interaction, when Business Central has a business event, or when Finance and Operations has a business event, or when we have a record that's created inside of Dynamics 365 Sales, or if I want to interact with SAP, right? Once again, this is Confab. We talk about all technologies. When a resource is published, when Teams has a posting that occurs inside of it, when a new team member is added, I can do something that's related to it. When I have an HTTP request from a pro dev perspective, I can have an event occur. So this is the example then of the user dev type perspective here that allows you to create these different types of flows. And these flows, just as an example, if I generate an opportunity notification and click on edit to it, allow me, when an agent calls a flow, to run a prompt and then send an email and then respond that back to the agent. I mean, how much easier can you get with it? So once again, these pro dev tools are what we use then excuse me, these citizen dev tools are what we use then to basically then go very rapidly, and usually departments own these types of functions and features because they'll have a subject matter expert that at the department level is the lead that is technically minded enough to be able to move basically that department forward. And it's a really important concept here. And then finally, obviously on the Power Platform, we get into Power BI, right? And some will say Power BI is not part of the Power Platform. Analyze, automate, and act. I'm going to keep it in there for a while. Fabric is kind of where it's at. But as you can see here, just as an example, these different types of reports can then access different data sources that we then interact with. So in this example, this is looking at Dynamics 365 Business Central for its data. But if I want to actually go through and take this and edit it, and I want to add to it, well, I can come in here and I can, for example, create a new tab, and then I can create a new bar chart that's inside of here. And I can say basically that I want to look at the customer name as the axis, and I want the posting date to be the x-axis, and I want the amount to be basically the multiples that is going to be inside of here, right? So this allows me to very rapidly create then different types of reports that access that data that's either in a storage account from a pro dev perspective or even then connected to an application inside of Dynamics for it. So this is why we have these tools. We have so many different tools because we have different types of communities and cultures on the Microsoft platform that we use to really drive this inside of obviously the Microsoft stack. Now, I wish we had more time to go through this in a lot more detail. I think the ending note that I want to leave all of you on is the fact that there's a lot of gray that we use to build solutions here. And the gray gets to be black and white based upon the business need. The people that are interacting with the technology are a factor. The scale of the technology is a factor. The repeatability and exception management are absolute factors. The communication need, whether it's email, Teams, or even lower level SOAP or web service requests, impact the solution. But here's the wonderful thing about the Microsoft platform. You have the ability to connect the pro dev with the citizen dev. You have the ability to make it so that you can have capabilities for end users that they can create and manage to help your organization scale so that you don't have to find that unicorn, so to speak, that knows all the technologies. Instead, you create a scalable business model where each department can control what they're interacting with, and then you centralize maybe some more of the core aspects by using ProDev to be able to do that. So this has been a fun one to kind of go through. I know it's been a lot of monologuing, obviously. I really appreciate the chat that people are interacting with. Obviously, there's lots of different types of capabilities here that we would love to talk to you about as well. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out to us because once again, all these technologies we use to really address business needs inside of your environment. With that, thank you again for participating in another Stone Ridge Confab. 2 weeks from now, we're going to have another great session, so make sure you subscribe and follow us on LinkedIn. You can get to us via YouTube, LinkedIn, or even technically on Twitch to basically watch these streams as well, as we've got a bunch of older ones that focus on AI enablement, as you can imagine, as well as all the different technologies that we support. And with that, have a great rest of your week, and thank you again for your time.